A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches others to obey these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment, and whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' will be answerable to the Sanhedrin, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to fiery Gehenna. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there recall that your brother has anything against you, leave your gift there at the altar. Go first and be reconciled with your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Settle with your opponent quickly while on the way to court. Otherwise, your opponent will hand you over to the judge, and the judge will hand you over to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Amen, I say to you, you will not be released until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body go into Gehenna. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife must give her a bill of divorce.' But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard it said to your ancestors, 'Do not take a false oath, but make good to the Lord all that you vow.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, nor by heaven, for it is God's throne, not by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Do not swear by your head, for you cannot make a single hair white or black. Let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Anything more is from the evil one." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
When I was a kid, I probably watched the original Star Wars trilogy more than my parents could bear, and probably more than was healthy for a kid or a teenager. But one of the most iconic moments in that original trilogy of movies was also one of the hardest concepts for me to wrap my head around. If you remember, in Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, Luke is going to the planet Dagobah to be trained by the great Jedi Master Yoda, a short, diminutive, green alien. He's a bit exasperated at this point in his training. Yoda commands him to do something, and Luke, with a sort of hopeless shrug of his shoulders, he says, "Okay, I'll try." And Yoda cuts him off very clearly. He says, "No, do or do not. There is no try." Now, as a kid, this drove me nuts. especially when my mom would tell me these words from Yoda. Because in my mind, I was asking myself this question: how is it possible? How can you do something if you do not first attempt to do it? Even if you succeed in doing, don't you first try? Isn't the necessary prerequisite for accomplishing or doing anything, big or small, trying or attempting? The first reading, that excerpt from the book of Sirach, especially that first powerful sentence, sounds a lot like Yoda's words. If you choose, you can keep the commandments. It's almost as though the author is saying, keep them. Keep the commandments. Do not try. Now, if you remember the larger context of this exchange between Luke Skywalker and Yoda, what Yoda is trying to teach Luke is that he has to believe that it's possible for it to happen. His problem is that he does not believe. Yoda, this diminutive figure, seems to do the impossible, right? Because Yoda tells him to lift the X-Wing fighter out of the muck of the swamp. And Luke starts to lift it out of the swamp, but he starts to despair. But Yoda shows him that it is possible. But that's Luke's problem. He does not believe that it is possible. Do we think this way about the commandments? Do we even think that it's possible to keep them? Or do we cut our legs off at our knees before we even begin? Do we think that the commandments are sort of pie in the sky, regulations maybe for a select few? Well, if God gives someone this special grace, or for a special man or woman, but for me, they're impossible. I can't keep them all. So I'll try to focus on 1, 3, 5, and 9, but the rest of them, I kind of give in. Do we choose to keep the commandments? Is that even a choice? Is it even a possibility for us? Or do we say, it's impossible, it's too hard? What do we choose? Maybe when we hear this sentence from Sirach, if you choose, you can keep the commandments, maybe we think in terms of choice as that sort of moment in which we choose to give in to temptation, or in which we choose to be holy and virtuous. Maybe we only think of that intense moment in which all of temptation is sort of besetting us, pulling us away, tempting us to be proud, to be lustful, to be dishonest, to be greedy. And that is our moment of choice. And I would say, yes, in one way, that is, of course, a moment of choice and a very important one. But just as important, if you will, of these singular moments are other choices. Just as important are other choosings. Before that moment of decision, what did we choose? What did we choose to sow in our minds and in our hearts? Have we sown weeds alongside wheat? Then, is it really a surprise that when it's time to harvest, that weeds of sin grow up alongside good, holy acts of virtue, wheat? The readings today challenge our assumption, even if it's not explicitly spoken, tacit assumption that we cannot, that keeping the commandments is impossible because it's too hard. Now, you might ask yourself, wait a minute, Father, isn't following Christ supposed to be free? Didn't he come to set us free, right? Didn't he come to liberate us? Isn't it supposed to be easy, right? I kind of remember Jesus talking about an easy and light yoke, right? The yoke, that sort of heavy burden that was laid on the backs of oxen as they plowed the fields. Didn't Jesus say, take my yoke upon yourself, for it is easy and light? Didn't St. Paul talk about freedom? Freedom from the law, freedom under the Spirit, in the liberty of the Spirit. Jesus doesn't make the law easier in the way that we are inclined to think about ease. Jesus deepens the law. He completes. He intensifies it. He does this 4 times over in the gospel passage that we heard from St. Matthew. You have heard it said, the Mosaic law. But I say to you. You have heard it said, 'You shall not kill.' But I say to you, it's not enough to simply refrain from murdering the person that drives you nuts. Beware of even thoughts of anger against that person. You have heard it said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I say to you, beware of looking at anyone with lust." Now, like the Bread of Life discourse in the Gospel of John, Jesus has the opportunity to ameliorate, to lighten or qualify in a qualified sense, right? When people were scandalized when he said, "This is my body and blood, and unless you eat it, you have not life within you," he does not back off, but he rather intensifies it. Same thing going on here in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus has the opportunity to say, well, it's not really that bad, or sort of remove aspects of the law. But he doesn't. Jesus intensifies it. He says, I'm saying this to you. This is a new law, completion of the old. Now, we might be inclined to think, well, okay, this is a modern question, right? This is something because of the weakness of modernity or secularism that we think that it's difficult or impossible to fulfill the law. But it's actually not. It's a very old question or a very old dispute. It is at least 500 years old. St. Thomas More, 500 years ago, in a time of great turmoil in England, in the time of the Reformation, this question came up. One of his great Christianized Socratic dialogues, a dialogue concerning heresies, he writes about a fictional exchange between himself and a university student who is sort of dabbling in the ideas of Luther and Luther's English followers. And this precise question of the ease of Christ's yoke comes up. Thomas More says this: "It is, I feel, harder not to swear at all than not to swear falsely. It is harder to forbear every angry word than not to kill. It is harder to watch and pray continually than to do so only on a few designated days. And then, what about the forbearing of every idle word? What a severe threat from an earthly point of view of something seemingly so small and unimportant. Almost never was such an intense thing said to the Jews by Moses as Christ says to us in that statement alone, when Christ says that on Judgment Day we shall give an account of every idle word. And then what are we to say about Christ's forbidding of divorce? Again, what comfort do you call this, that we are obliged, under pain of perpetual damnation, to suffer whatever kind of affliction and shameful death, whatever kind of martyrdom for the profession of our faith? Do you believe that these ease-giving words of his easy yoke and his light burden were not spoken as much to the apostles of Christ as they are to you? And yet what ease did Christ call his apostles to? Did he not call them to watching, fasting, praying, preaching, traveling, hunger, thirst, cold and heat, beatings, scourgings, imprisonment, painful and shameful death? The easiness of Christ's yoke does not consist in bodily ease, nor does the lightness of his burden consist in the slackening of any bodily pain, unless we are so oblivious that whereas Christ himself did not gain heaven without pain, we somehow expect to get there with play. The easiness of Christ's yoke consists in the sweetness of hope, whereby we experience in our pain a pleasant taste of heaven. This is the thing, as the great Saint Gregory Nazianzus explains, this is what refreshes people who are laden and makes our yoke easy and our burden light. Christ is telling us in today's gospel very clearly and very explicitly that following him will not be easy. It has never been, and it never will. And like so many other saints, people who had to suffer persecution and loss for their integrity in the faith, St. Thomas More saw the importance and the power of hope, the presence of hope in suffering. Now, of course, we might think in terms of martyrs, physical suffering, the shedding of blood, the loss of life and of limb. But I would say suffering also includes spiritual suffering, specifically the sting of our conscience, that indictment that our internal law makes upon us when we see, I was not kind, I hurt the people that were closest to me, I was lustful, I was unjust, I stole, I was a bad person. Perhaps this is what we fear the most of all. This is perhaps what keeps us from doing, what keeps us from keeping or obeying the commandments, because first of all, we are afraid of failure. Hope and the power of hope, the theological virtue, is only possible when Christ dwells within us. God does not stand afar off and say, good luck, go on. If you will, this is a sort of Pelagianism of the Jedi or of Star Wars, right? They have to do it on their own power. But Christ teaches us these are only possible. It is only possible to keep the commandments if you allow me to dwell within you. Having the power of hope is something that is impossible without the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. As we prepare to come forward and receive that great aid to the indwelling of God, the body and the blood of Christ, may we